So I asked a question in the Last of Us video. That felt gross to say. Last and last shouldn't go together like that. But if you guys wanted me to continue on with the series, going over like 2 episodes or every other episode or something like that, it seems like you guys were down for it. Well, I watched episodes 3 and 4, and I think I legitimately only saw 1 infected and a caved-in floor the whole time, so there really isn't too much in the way of actual new biological infections. There is, however, something that hints at the Cordyceps playing a bigger role in taking over an area and potentially even how the species is currently operating given all the new incoming biomass. So today's episode, I think we should do this. Talk about the episodes as we always do, which I think new people must be finding the channel because they seem to be completely confused as to why I do summaries. Well, it's basically because people may not have watched the same things like you or I have watched, and it kind of helps set up an understanding of the material, and then go on into like what was going on with Frank at the end if you were confused about that, and then move on to what in the name of all that is holy is that crater and food storage. Also, if you can, go outside and watch this and it'll all become clear in a little bit. But first, this episode is sponsored by Factor. Are you ready to start eating healthier, resulting in more energy and an overall more satiated feeling brought on by nutrients? It's well known at this point that what you eat is pretty much more important than what you do. I think the only people who can actually outwork a bad diet are military members who are running like 20 miles a day. So for the rest of us, body composition and level of health are dictated by what we decide to put into our bodies. Well, with Factor's fresh, never frozen meals delivered straight to your door, this leaves time and energy for you to tackle your to-do lists, like getting ripped in the gym or vacuuming your house and everything in between. Not to mention, they have specialized meals whether you are on keto, being calorie smart, are vegan, or bulking with the Protein Plus meals. With up to 34 chef-prepared meals that are dietitian approved, you're sure to find something you like. I personally love Factor, and even outside of what they send me, have signed up for weekly deliveries because the meals help fuel my workouts, and overall, it makes it more easy when you can just microwave the meal for like 2 minutes and it's ready to go. Takes out all the guesswork. So by heading to factor75.com and using code Roanoke50, you can get 50% off your first Factor box. Start taking control of your health today with healthy eating. All right, let's get back to it. As we start this thing, I also want to say thank you again for all the support over on Roanoke Tales. It means a lot that so many people are actually interested in like the real life horror stuff I'm kind of covering and subscribing. Should have a video going over the disappearances of people in the Missing 411 documentary, so if that interests you, well, you know where to find it. But let's get to it. We kick off episode 3 with a cold river and a hairline fractured knuckle. I have never understood what was the deal with stacking rocks, but apparently people do, so hey, who am I to judge? They are 10 miles west of Boston, and I have to ask, does this actually, like, is this really what it looks like 10 miles west of Boston? I figured it was like way more developed than that. He heads back to Ellie and then throws her some food as they get ready to head out. But no, seriously, does that what it really looks like out there? Like, if it does, I may actually have to go visit. So Ellie tells Joel to get over Tess, basically because nobody made them take her out west, which is pretty based. Also, I need y'all to confirm if I like had a stroke or something. I'm like 98% sure I heard Tess being called Tessa like occasionally in the video game. Do y'all remember that, or am I just straight tripping? It's completely possible I'm misremembering something. I haven't played it in years. Regardless of that though, they start their 5-hour hike through an area which IMO, I'd actually like to find and hike as it looks pretty nice. As they walk along, Joel's on the lookout for people, and as they walk, he mentions how he got his scar. Someone took a pot shot at him and he missed, but he also missed his pot shot as well. Heading to the gas station, Joel and Ellie head inside to get the stuff that he had stashed long ago. Ellie heads into the back. Again, she can still be, ripped apart, but finding a door to the basement, she heads down, which no thanks. Getting down there, she sees an infected that's just sort of hanging out, crushed under a pile of debris. Looking at him, judging by his eyes, I'm gonna go out on a limb and say his liver is virtually destroyed due to all the jaundice he currently has. Using her knife, she makes an incision under the skin and then sees the cordyceps sort of wrapping the body in a type of fascia. She then takes him out, releasing him from this horrible timeline. Joel goes to check on Ellie as Joel leaves his rifle behind because there's no ammo for it anywhere, so it's basically useless. But you could always swing away, Meryl, so I mean, there is that. Continuing their hike, 15 miles outside of Boston at this point, they see a plane that crashed, which is my worst nightmare actually. We then get some information on the outbreak. Ellie mentions how it was like a monkey bite, which again, I have to stress, I'm telling you, someone watched my video. Maybe that's just egotistical to say because I'm sure other people had the same exact idea as well, but it wasn't a monkey bite. It's the cordyceps going through the system that then becomes familiar with the primate immune system and somatic cells that was then able to jump to humans due to those similarities. But Joel says it was the cordyceps that jumped from the food and then was shipped all over the world, and then people ate it on Thursday night, and by Friday morning and then Friday night, people began changing, then by Monday, it was all over. As they walk, Joel says they need to probably cut through the woods here, but Ellie wants to keep walking on the road. As she walks up to a ditch, well, there's a bunch of civilian skeletons. A week after, soldiers went to the countryside to evacuate towns. All right, so here's the fun part about all this. You go to a rural area, and then you evacuate those towns where those people probably could have kept these things at bay if you just like put up a fence, right? So you bring them to a city, which is densely populated because it's a QZ. It's like, I know you need to consolidate everybody, but bringing them to a city that is surrounded by infected has got to be the most dumb idea I've ever heard in my life. Like, what was the thought process behind any of that? Why not, create a bunch of shipping containers out in the middle of a giant field and then surround that? I mean, I get cities have the infrastructure, but you're just begging for people to be infected in the QZ, which is exactly like what happens all over because, as you'll see in a minute, Baltimore was having issues and Federal was kind of being giant douche canoes about it. It seems like a bad idea to grab people in sparsely populated areas and cram them into a heavily populated area where there's already an active outbreak. Government, am I right? But basically, if there was room at the QZ that you went to, then hey, you're good to go. But if there was no room, then you became a skeleton. We now flash over to September 30th, 2003. The town is being rounded up as Bill sits in his basement as soldiers move through the house above. The civilians going to their new skeleton lives right out of town, leaving Bill, who is clearly a prepper. His massive distrust of the government basically left him with all this material to survive as he's been stockpiling. So he does the next best thing, goes and gets more stuff. Heading to the gas station, he gets it back on, then heading to the Home Depot, he gets more material before heading to the natural gas station as well, and turning back on the natural gas there. Basically all the things he needs to stay alive through this entire thing. From here, it becomes about setting traps and growing food. Now, I'm gonna be real with you. Nothing really happens here. Bill's kind of like, his traps work pretty well, and we see only one infected. This is what we'll see for 2 episodes. And he just gets totally shreked by traps in quite literally 10 seconds. But as Bill works on one of his traps, he gets a heads up that someone else has fallen into a hole. We now meet Frank. If you didn't know, episode 3 is about exploring the relationship in depth, which was only quasi hinted at in the game, and if I recall, Frank would go on to basically give Bill the middle finger, head out alone, get infected, and then take himself out. From there, it was unclear what Bill's fate would be, since he was kind of losing the only person he loved. But in this episode, we have a fairly large detraction from the game, but we'll also see that in episode 4, so it really doesn't matter. So Frank's in a hole. He's from Baltimore QZ, but it was destroyed. Now, for all those who remember why it was destroyed, it's because the residents there got a little upsetty over the Iron Fist of Fedra, so they overthrew the QZ leaders and then took over. Then they became raiders. Then they started snatching up any people in the area, looting them and burning them, and if I recall correctly, there was some cannibalism as well. Obviously, Frank seems like a conscientious objector to that, so he noped out trying to head to Boston, only to fall into one of these traps. But Bill, being the paranoid stand-up guy that he is, throws down a ladder as Frank comes up. He checks him to see if he's infected. Bill then points to where Boston is, but Frank says he's starving. Bill tells Frank that this is not an Arby's, so there's no free lunches, which then Frank mentions Arby's does in fact charge for food. So at this point, Bill and Frank head back as Bill drops off some clothes to him, and he makes some food. Frank begins to gather that Bill is here alone, given all the dust everywhere. So Bill and Frank hang out at this point as Bill offers more food if he's hungry. Frank mentions how he will be going, but then heads over to the piano. He plays a song about how love will abide. Not my type of music, but hey, it's just like rock stacking. Everyone's got their own thing. So then Bill plays a song from here, and basically Frank and Bill are compatible. So now we jump over to 3 years later. The progression of a relationship, am I right? Frank bursts outside, basically telling Bill to go F himself, as he wants to fix up the town and the street because it looks like crap. This requires more resources, but Bill acquiesces, but there's an ulterior motive here. Frank met someone on the radio and has invited them over to eat some food, which makes Bill rather upset, as if anybody figures out they're out there, that could be a really big issue, because you don't know if it's Fedra or Raiders or Joel. Mainly because, remember, Joel picks up Ellie in 2023, but he mentions all throughout how he used to run with a bad group of people to survive, and it's only like 2010 right now, so there's no telling if that's during this specific time frame or Joel was kind of a doucher previously, but we will get there. Bill knows what's up, and he asks him just to tell him why he wants to fix these things up, because he's kind of learned Frank at this point, and it's because you get to know people. The same thing with my wife. If she's mad and I ask her, hey, are you mad about something? And she just says no continuously, I'll ask 6 more times, then it'll finally come out. It's about knowing people. Bill tells him that they have no friends, to which this leads to a garden party with Tess and Joel. Bill stays strapped or gets clapped as Tess and Frank talk about random things. Then they leave Joel and Bill outside alone. Joel says he understands, but Bill really needs to get that force multiplier out of his face. Joel just wants to trade with him. Bill says that they don't need his help, but Joel says the fence over there has about a year tops. That says he said that he can bring him some wire that'll last them the rest of their lives. Here, Tess and Frank then set up the code for the 80s music, meaning danger, as Joel tells Bill about the raiders, when they would show up, and how it would go down. 3 years later, also my nightmare, going out for a run with your partner, they run over to the back of a house as Frank has grown strawberries after trading the handheld for seeds. It was a small handheld though, so it was an acceptable trade. Then later that night, things are happening. The raiders have officially arrived. Frank wakes up as the house is being fired on as he gets strapped, but Bill is already out there in the worst defensive position I have ever seen in my life. The middle of the street, not hiding behind anything. Literally, if somebody's not caught in your traps, they could just stand back and pop you in the gut. Which he takes one in the gut as the raiders are then getting destroyed by the traps because they don't realize to stand 10 feet back from the fence. Frank clears the bullet while Bill then tells him the information that he needs and tells him to call Joel as he can't be there alone, to which Bill then passes out. We now jump ahead 10 years. Frank ain't looking so hot. He's gotten into painting, but his limbs appear to be failing him. Bill walks around watering the plants as then they head into that night to eat. Bill asks Frank if he took his pills, but he can't get them open. Then they head to bed that night as Frank's meat suit appears to have basically completely given up the fight, which is not good, considering that there's, infected running around. The next morning, Frank made it to his chair and tells Bill that he's going to stay awake as this is his last day. Bill then asks what if they find a doctor, but Frank responds there was no cure for this when the world hadn't gone to hell in a handbasket. So the plan is as follows. Take car, go to mom's house, kill Phil. Wait, wrong show. Eat some toast, go to the boutique, get married, cook dinner, grind up a bunch of pills, put it in the wine, drink the wine, then go to bed. Sounds like a good plan for Frank, but bro, that's like a horrible plan for the other person. Billy Boy over here. Oh yeah, just leave him with the traumatic experience, joy bound. So the plan carries out pretty much without a hitch. That night, they sit down to have some wine. Bill puts pills in Frank's wine, which would make that taste absolutely awful, and then hands it to him. Then they both chug their wine, which Frank asks if there were already pills in the bottles, and Bill says yes, that he's going out too. So they are both biting the dust at this point, and man, that's gotta be a weird feeling to know that you have a countdown timer. Bill and Frank then go to bed, which allows for the music on the radio to start playing 80s, as Bill could not reset it, indicating that there is a problem. So finally, Joel and Ellie make it to the compound. Heading to the house, they notice the dead plants, which is not a great indicator of what's inside. The food is still out, basically rotted, and Ellie finds a letter with a key. Joel finds their bedroom door locked and goes to check on Ellie. He reads the letter and, Bill left all of his stuff to him to protect Tess. Whoops. Heading to the garage, he finds the POS Chevy S10, and I have to agree, an old Tacoma would have been a better choice, or even a 4Runner, of which mine is still making a metallic scraping noise, and for the life of me, I can't figure out what it is. And it's not the dust shield that goes on the brakes because I already pulled those back to basically maximum. Joel also finds the material to make a battery in the fridge, so he crafts one. Hopefully he's got that skill unlocked, but then he heads back inside. Joel checks Ellie's arm and agrees to take her out west. Joel then tells Ellie that they need to keep their histories separate and to themselves, so don't bring up Tess, along with some other demands. They then raid everything they can from Bill's house. Ellie ends up finding a force multiplier and hides it in her bag. So then they end up getting the truck and start heading out to Wyoming, and then pulls back from a window, and just like the game, this was actually a really sad episode. Moving on to episode 4. We get more hate on my video for mentioning real world things. As always, we will get there. We open up this episode with Ellie going I don't know, are you talking to me? I don't see anyone else here. Are you talking to me on the mirror? Almost before looking down the barrel. And look, I get it's a prop, but good lord, it activates my almonds. Also, her trigger discipline is painful, but I guess that's the point right now. So she heads outside to meet Joel as he's pulling gas from vehicles. So it's time to learn about gas with Roanoke. So it's been, I don't know, about 20 years since this gas has been sitting in this gas tank. Joel mentions how it's almost watered. Bruh. All right, so what happens with gas is if you don't put a stabilizer in it, it might last a year under the best conditions if you're lucky. But gas by itself can go bad anywhere between 1 to 6 months. What happens is the lighter hydrocarbons will evaporate out of it. On top of that, the water will separate pretty much because of the ethanol, and that will also evaporate out. This leads to a thicker substance than gas that will cause it to clog up injectors and fuel lines. It is said to be comparable to varnish almost, and that's after just a few years. After 20 years, bro, forget about it. The evaporating water would eat a hole in the gas tank itself, exposing it to the elements, leaving nothing behind is all I'm saying. Now, a case could be made that since it's a colder climate in Kansas, that sort of preserved it, but the summers are still just as hot. I've been up to Iowa before in a cornfield in July. It's excruciating. So there's no explaining the car running off this concoction. Remember, no fun allowed on this channel. Anyhow, as Ellie tortures Joel with puns after he says no wandering, this is directly from the game itself, which is pretty dope. Then they head out as all the cars are pushed to the sides, which is actually pretty useful. So they play some Hank Williams, which if I played it here, I would get absolutely copyright hit into oblivion. And then Ellie finds one of Bill's magazines. She throws it out the window as they continue through the middle of the country. And man, doing this trip myself in September, it was pretty wild. It really do be taking a while. And they also pass an Arby's that gives out free lunches if you didn't know. But here's something that's interesting to think about. I believe it's called Sonder, basically the realization that everyone you pass, their life is as simple and complicated as yours, with their own connections, feelings, family, friends, enemies, life, hardships, pretty much everything. As they drive through, it gives you the feeling that there's destruction. I mean, you can see the destruction everywhere, and that was probably a traumatic experience in someone's life, but completely unknown. It would remain unknown unless you came into that area. Sort of like being in the US. How many battles against the infected were fought and lost or even won in like Europe or Asia or Australia is just hanging out there fighting emus? Who knows? I get that feeling a lot actually when I drive cross country. It's always been, I think that's why I like driving cross country. It's like there's so much more out there with much more complicated things. It kind of broadens your view of the entire world. Flying just doesn't do the same thing. My ramblings aside, they pull off for the night into the woods, which they're supposed to be near Kansas, I believe, so I wonder where these hills and woods are. They eat some really old Chef Boyardee, and Joel once again reminds Ellie that there are people out there that probably would see the smoke, and she doesn't know that they would see the smoke, so they aren't going to start any fire unless they want to get absolutely shreked. They then go to bed for the night as Ellie tells Joel another pun. She then asks if those people would know where they were, to which Joel says, nah, they probably wouldn't, but now he's not so sure, so he ends up standing guard pretty much the whole night. Cortisol levels have blown through the roof. Joel looks exhausted, which looks exactly how I look after camping, and Ellie maps out their route, taking 70 west forever, which is true. It really does feel like it goes on forever. They then talk about how Tommy wanted to like save the world sort of scenario. He joined the army, then joined the Raiders with Joel, then joined the Fireflies, and left all three, which means now Joel has to go and find him. Ellie asks, bro, if you don't even have any hope for the world, then why keep going? He then tells her that she's cargo and that's why he's helping. Ellie then fast travels to Kansas City as they are forced to stop at a semi-truck that probably ruined everyone's lives as it blocked the whole tunnel back in the day. I know that's like an S10 piece of junk, but I kind of feel like you could go around the tunnel on the grass and get where you needed to go. Joel decides to do the more dangerous way and go up into the actual city. They then get turned around because the map blows and they pass a burning pile of remains. What fun! They then head to a QZ that has obviously been broken into as someone approaches the truck pretending to be hurt, which we all remember this. So the attack on the car begins with the dude limping towards them pretending like, oh, I've been hurt, and or maybe I'm infected. Like, why would anybody help you? So, you know, pretty much the classics of trying to rob people. So Joel basically tells Ellie to buckle up and they gun it, to which everyone goes, here, have brick, as Joel then runs over some spike strips which blow out his tires, causing him to crash into a storefront. So then everyone starts opening up on the vehicle, and here's my problem with this. See, in Baltimore, those people were like ruthless animals, right? But in Kansas City, we find out it's actually just like a settlement type of deal. So why did they open up on Joel and Ellie in the first place? I guess they're just trying to rob them. I guess it could be like rob all outsiders sort of deal. But honestly, it just doesn't go with the general flow of things later. You'll see what I mean. Joel tells Ellie to go into a hole in the wall as Joel starts stacking bodies. He takes one guy out from across the way and the other walks up to try to get him. And then Joel takes him out like, why would you walk up directly in the line of fire? Anyways, then a dude bursts through as it turns into a hand-to-hand combat sort of scenario as a guy yells about how Joel ended himself. Like, you guys attacked first. Ellie comes out and then puts a round into his lumbar, completely paralyzing him. So he does the standard thing at this point when people lose a fight and says, oh, we're not fighting anymore, LOL JK. Then Ellie goes back into the wall and Joel takes him out as he yells for his mom. That's not good. So Joel and Ellie now leave the area because surely a patrol is coming, and coming it does. The group finds the bodies of those that got, and we now move over to the Fedra holding area as a woman named Kathleen questions a doctor. He won't answer anything, as apparently he told on the group back in the day, but then they overthrew the local Fedra, to which Kathleen now puts a force multiplier to his head. A guy named Henry apparently took out Kathleen's brother, and now she's upset. The doctor continues to say that, I'm a doctor! And Kathleen then hears a car horn outside, so she goes outside. The group brought back the bodies from Joel's encounter, and I can't figure out if Kathleen is this dude's mom or not. See, on the one hand, he mentions how his mom basically had enough pull to trade with them. But on the other hand, she doesn't seem to be bothered by the end of her child. But then on the other hand, life is pretty cruel at this point and chaotic. So she might just be kind of numb to it. Personally, I think this was her son, and she was just consumed by finding Henry, who took out her brother, which will play into later decisions. So she asks if the doctor will help kind of keep at least one of them alive, which apparently it won't, which means the doctor in the cell has basically just lost his usefulness and didn't even know it. Although other sickness is bound to crop up, so do whatever you want, Kathleen. Kathleen then walks back to his cell and takes him out in there. See, while Fedra sucks pretty hard, the people that tend to take over the areas are even worse. She then issues an order to find every collaborator against their regime and just take them out, as we the people set out in some questionable vehicle modifications like run written on a plow. We the people are taking out we the people. It's like, okay. So Joel and Ellie are hiding in a store at this time, so as they plan to kind of head to a tall building about 4 blocks away for the night. Joel apologizes to Ellie, telling her she shouldn't have had to take out that one dude or at least injure him, but she says it wasn't really her first time doing that. At this point, Joel realizes, maybe in Zombieland, everyone has done something that they're not really proud of, and he's not the only one who's had to survive. So he teaches her the proper way to hold a force multiplier, and then tells her to keep it in the bag. And I can't tell you how many times the barrel either faced Joel or Ellie at this point, which again, made me like mega cringe. But as she goes to put the force multiplier in her pocket, what ends up actually happening is Joel tells her, no, don't put it in your pocket, put it in your bag as you'll blow your back end off. But she basically takes that idea and ignores it as she puts it in her pocket, and they head out for a tall building. Back at our fearless leader's position, another guy walks up to her and says they found evidence of Henry. Going up to the attic, there are cans of food and drawings everywhere of the 2 brothers. Then Mr. Longhair then takes her to food storage as Kathleen says they need to guard it because Henry and his brother are out of food, but then the ground has sunken in. She seems to understand what this is as the ground shifts with growling. Longhair then asks her how they should handle it, to which once again she's consumed by finding Henry, so she says they'll handle it after. That's usually not a good thing. That night, Joel and Ellie then break into the building through the parking garage and find stairs that go up 45 stories. Joel says they're going up as high as he can make it. He's 56, so his knees aren't exactly smooth as butter. Joel tells her that he's been on both sides of ambushes, and that's how he knew that guy wasn't actually injured in the beginning. She asks then if he's taken out innocent people, to which he doesn't answer. So they break into a room, I think on like the 39th floor for the night, as Joel spreads glass around so he can hear anyone trying to get in. Joel then asks Ellie about hurting people, which she doesn't really want to talk about it either. Ellie then asks Joel if he knew that diarrhea was hereditary because it runs in your genes, which I gotta tell you, that one made me laugh as well. So then they go to sleep, only for Joel to be abruptly woken up, as the glass did not do its job, as 2 people have shown up holding them at force multiplied point. It's clearly Henry and his brother, judging by the superhero eye paint. So I was racking my brain trying to figure out what science whatsoever existed in these episodes, because I think you're probably thinking what I'm thinking, which is these were just kind of filler episodes. But that doesn't mean this has to be a filler episode, because there are breadcrumbs of diseases and hints as to something under the floor in Kansas City that we can discuss. So let's turn this into a whole sandwich, shall we? Starting with the Frank, I bet you're a lot like me in the respect that you were trying to figure out what the name of all this holy did this random illness come from and what was it. Just seemed to appear rapidly and without warning. But there are a few context clues surrounding what happened to him that gives us more information on the disease and likely even identifying it. But we must first understand what were his symptoms before learning about what was actually going on internally. The first thing to note about him was his overall difficulty walking. While mentioned, it took him all night to get to his chair on the last day, and this would imply that it was not an injury such as him being paralyzed or anything of that nature. His legs are still somewhat functional but incredibly weak. On top of that, we see his paintings have a severe progression of weakness in the arms. At first, his paintings on the left side seemed relatively normal. Granted, I couldn't paint anything like that, but it's clear the right side is a later date where his disease has progressed to the point that he could only get a few strokes of the brush in before his arm would fall and he could no longer hold up anything. This would imply that there is some sort of neurodegenerative disorder taking place in his body, resulting in a muscular issue. Because while he is aging, his body does not look all that frail. Once again, this is to suggest that there might not be such an issue as atrophy. Later on, we see Bill mention all the pills that Frank is on for his disease, and this also suggests that, again, it has something to do with his nerves. So enough beating around the bush, what is it exactly? And we are going to get into this because neurodegenerative diseases are fascinating, if not something worthy of inspiring abject terror. I believe Frank is showing the later symptoms of multiple sclerosis. And what is multiple sclerosis? Which I have no idea why, but that is such a difficult word for me to say, so we're going to call it MS, which is what everybody else calls it. But sclerosis means scar. So essentially, it comes out to basically multiple scars or even lesions forming. What happens is the body will produce immune cells that in turn go and attack the myelin sheath of neurons. The myelin sheath is sort of like the insulation of the neural cell. It helps propel the electrical signal quicker down the line, helping to get information from neuron to neuron much quicker, thus making your thoughts and movements almost instant to you. It does this by speeding up the action potential conduction. Now, the problem is when this gets attacked by the immune system, this can wreak havoc on the body, as you might imagine, and this will slow down the neuronal ability to quickly send signals or stop them completely. The body will attempt to repair these areas, but it will still leave a scar that slowly over time builds up on the nervous system tissue and can result in longer lasting symptoms and pretty much permanent symptoms attack after attack. Typically, people can expect within a few days to few weeks to be back to around 80 to 100% of where they were initially, but as these attacks continue, this will result in worse and worse symptoms as the body isn't able to heal fully and the damage is continuing to build up. Things like muscle stiffness, spasms, severe weakness, or yes, even paralysis have been seen, and this is typically within the legs. With Frank, while he's near paralysis, he's still somewhat able to move apparently, and his legs are still somewhat functional. I say somewhat, probably like 5% of what they were. And this indicates that, again, he isn't fully paralyzed, so it's probably not an injury sort of issue. It's kind of a self-injury, I suppose. Also, problems with your bladder, bowels, and reproductive functions begin to creep in as well. As this disease progresses, eventually it can result in the brain suffering the same effects, which can lead to forgetfulness and word-finding difficulties, as well as depression, anxiety, and mood swings, and sometimes even seizures in the most rare cases. Essentially, as the body continues to attack the nervous system, any area of the body that is actively experiencing issues, it's kind of like the immune system grabbing the neurons' arms basically and asking them why they're hitting themselves. You can end up with things like momentarily blindness, for instance, if the optic nerve is attacked, breathing issues, and again, movement problems as always, but basically everything that makes you pilot your meat suit is having difficulties operating normally while the immune system is going just dumb ape mode. But you might be asking, Roanoke, why does the body do this? Well, interestingly enough, it appears to be somewhat linked to nutrient deficiencies, believe it or not. Now, obviously, this could be a which came first sort of scenario, but it's been observed in those with MS, their vitamin D levels will have been consistently low or chronically low, which, vitamin D plays a role in the immune system and how it attacks bacteria and viruses. So in people, for instance, of European descent, such as in Canada, northern parts of the United States, Europe itself, southern Australia, and New Zealand, it seems that the angle of sunlight and the fact that the sun goes down a lot earlier can affect people's ability to get vitamin D there. So as a result, MS is more prevalent in these people and seems to have originated actually in people who were from places like Northern Europe that, we moved away from the equator and then up to less sunlight. But why is this? Immune cells walk a fine line biochemically speaking. They must be sensitive enough to recognize foreign invaders like bacteria and viruses, but not so reactive that they attack an animal's own tissues, paving the way for autoimmune disorders. Animals use a variety of mechanisms to strike this balance. One way is by regulating the activity of T cells, which are the immune cells that can trigger an immune response to billions of different molecules through a range of processes. In one process, known as deletion autoreactive T cells, which attack the body, they're killed off. Another process involves making a subset of T cells develop into a specialized type called suppressor T cells or T regulatory cells. The suppressor T cells can then regulate the behavior of other immune cells, damping down autoimmune reactions. In addition to these two well-studied mechanisms for avoiding autoimmunity, evidence is mounting that animals have another tool at their disposal, a process called adaptation. This process seems to come into play, especially when the immune system faces a persistent infection or continually reacts to the body's own tissues. In these cases, avoiding a fatal autoimmune response requires keeping the immune system in check. In adaptation, immune cells become habituated to foreign or apparently foreign proteins and tone down their activity. But how adaptation works together with deletion and regulation by suppressor T cells to avoid autoimmunity has kind of been difficult to understand. Neville Singh, Chuan Chen, and Ronald Schwartz studied adaptation in isolation from the other mechanisms for avoiding autoimmunity and found support for the view that adaptation is a mechanism independent of other deletion and regulation by suppressor T cells. The researchers injected T cells into a strain of mice that were engineered to lack their own T cells. The injected T cells hadn't encountered any foreign or activating proteins and so are called naive T cells. Singh and his colleagues would then watch the injected T cells adjust adjust to their new environment, and because the host animals had no T cells of their own, the naive T cells could adjust without interference from native T cells and had matured into the mice's body. The researchers found that injected T cells multiplied as they do in mounting and immune responses to something foreign, but then over about a week adapted to the new environment. The injected T cells toned down their activity but persisted in the animals' bodies for more than about 2 months without invoking deletion. They did not develop into suppressor T cells either. Despite the adaptation of the injected T cells, they caused the mice to develop arthritis and autoimmune disease after a few months. This was a surprise since the T cells appeared to have adjusted to being in the mice. To pin down how the T cells cause this autoimmune response, the researchers injected naive T cells into another mouse strain, which lacks B cells, immune cells that create antibodies against foreign proteins. The B cells typically do this only after being triggered by T cells that have recognized foreign cells. The researchers let the T cells adapt to being in the mice and then introduce B cells from outside. Surprisingly, although the adapted T cells seemed to tolerate the body's tissues, they still retained their ability to activate B cells, which then produced a variety of antibodies against the body's own tissues, eventually leading to this arthritis. In the final set of experiments, Singh and his colleagues put the naive T cells into the adult mice of a strain born supplied with its own T cells. In this case, contrary to the earlier experiments, the naive T cells did not give the mice arthritis and produced other signs of autoimmune response. The T cells still undergo adaptation, but are subsequently deleted slowly. Interestingly, in the presence of a full set of T cells, the autoreactive T cells also developed fewer effector functions. Together, these results suggest that to keep T cells from developing in a way that promotes autoimmunity, 2 kinds of regulation are necessary. First, there's the adaptation of the T cells to other cells that they see for a long time. And second, there's the regulation that comes with the competing amongst a variety of T cells that have gone through normal development in the animal. One of the things being looked into also currently is the vitamin D nutrient effect on glands such as the thymus itself, where the process of clonal deletion or the process of destroying these autoimmune cells takes place. However, in the meantime, just between you, me, and the floorboards, if you can't stand outside for 15 minutes in the sunlight, even if it's cloudy and are of European descent, then, it may be wise for you to start taking a vitamin D3 supplement just for your health. But anyways, that'll give your body the standard dose needed for proper functioning. But that's what I believe is happening with Frank. He's in the later stages of MS, where attack after attack continued to happen, and considering the pills he's taking, which in 2003 may have helped, after such a long time, they've probably gone past their shelf life, leading to less and less effectiveness because the active ingredients to prevent the issues, they're basically no longer viable for this long. Today, there are about over 20 different medications that can help you, as it's been over 20 years since 2003, which is alarming. And we as a species are closer basically to understanding the mechanisms behind the disorder, but for now, it's about decreasing the symptoms and frequency of attacks and also detrimental effects of the attacks. But see, I told you sitting outside was a good idea. By now you absorbed all the vitamin D you need for the day. And now this leads us into episode 4, which raises a lot of questions that haven't really been answered, but I imagine we will basically be answering these in episode 5. So first things first, with Bill and Frank saga, we are missing something that I thought would have been pretty critical to the progression of the story, and that's the bloater is nowhere to be seen. He was supposed to be in the school in Bill's town, but we all saw how that went down, and on top of that, Joel and Ellie weren't supposed to be this far out by now. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not complaining about that, because apart from the artistic liberty stuff, they've been pretty faithful to the game in ways that's making the show fairly enjoyable to watch. But this may hint at what's under the ground in food storage. For anyone that saw my bloater video like 4 years ago that got demonetized and was my first step into the, sorry, we know this may be disappointing to hear after we already confirmed it's suitable, but you can go F yourself, automated message, I'm still a little salty about that. But we know that there are a few qualifiers for the creation of the bloater versus just your standard clicker. Clickers are just one person who's been heavily infested by the Cordyceps and has had it enter the brain and permeated throughout, allowing for it to take complete control of the human meat suit. The issue is the human body only has around 125,822 calories on average. So between what the body is using to survive, to move around, and even while the resting state is still burning calories, and what the Cordyceps is also using to divide and stay alive, it's kind of utilizing all of the body's energy, so the lifespan is extremely limited. This is why Joel mentions they're kind of up and walking around for like a month or two and then drop, although older clickers, the more they eat, the more successful they are. The bloater is a way around this, however, and it seems to take place under very specific situations. Bill's town in the game, the bloater was locked in a storage closet and then left in there. It is unknown how many others were in there with him, but if I recall, I think there were a few others. There was also likely food sources within the room as well, considering that this was a staging area for an ongoing evacuation. We know with the infected, typically they will link up via mycelium and then connect on a neurological level to a degree by utilizing the fungus. This appears to be the exchange of nutrients amongst the whole group. But that's where the issue is. As they add more people, while the bodies have more calories and it's adding to the amount present, it's also increasing the caloric burn overall. Think of it sort of like a rocket. You need it to weigh a certain amount because the more fuel you add, the more fuel you need to get it into space to carry the weight of that fuel that you need to get it into space. Eventually, a tipping point is reached where the rocket is not able to make it because it has too much fuel to carry up, and there's not enough fuel or enough explosive force in that fuel to push that fuel. It's kind of like a fine balance. The same could be said for those that are infected. If you add too many of the infected to this network, eventually the caloric strain on the system is too great, which results in what we saw in episode 2, where eventually the fungus runs out of nutrients, as to add too many bodies is to pull away too many nutrients, which then results in the desiccation and destruction of the fungus. Where the clickers find themselves to become bloaters, it seems very unique. And I would imagine the process needs to follow something that is purely a calorie surplus and requires no calories to burn in return. Ha, that rhymed. Under the ground, there seems to be something growing, causing a slight cave-in in the middle of food storage. And where this may be actually under the ground is an area known as Subtropolis. Under the ground in Kansas City is an artificial bluff above the Missouri River that is essentially a storage facility. Now, this storage facility is located somewhat on the outside of Kansas City. However, it is incredibly close, and some parts of it may actually extend underneath the city, and some portions actually do appear to reside under the outskirts of the city itself. I would not believe it to be too far-fetched to think that this storage area has some infected underneath, or at least had a few people trapped in there. I mean, there was no telling what Fedra was actually doing, and they had like a ready-made storage area where they could store food, they could keep it away from the people, and the control that they could exercise over everyone, considering everything was underground, was pretty much well known. As time passed in this dark area with probably some infected in it, because of the proximity due to the river, the humidity would likely be higher, and the cordyceps fused people began spreading underneath the ground itself. Once there, it was able to access food storage from this survival group and then began absorbing the nutrients from their food. Upon it reaching this area, it would then realize a mycelium root basically hit a pocket of nutrients, so it would start to send more and larger mycelium to this area, which would destabilize the ground, leading to this area to be quasi-caved in. So two things may exist underneath this area. Either it is in fact a single individual who is being kept alive and is becoming super saturated with cordyceps due to its proximity with the food above it and the survivors and all this good stuff, or it is a brand new trait the cordyceps has formed, which much like how it causes fascia to form under the skin of humans and then spread to conquer the whole body, it may be doing the same thing with the planet itself, existing under the crust of the planet and reacting to nutrients and possibly even human movement, which is absolutely horrifying if you think about it. But I guess we will figure out, like in the next episode when that drops, that it's just probably another group digging below the ground to completely destroy my theory, because let's be real here. First it was the monkeys don't have to bite to spread cordyceps, which I never said. And then it's like, oh, it's definitely not the excrement from them that was able to get in the food. And then second, gas doesn't turn into water. The water evaporates out. I'm not coping. You're coping. Well, anyhow, I want to thank you guys for watching. If you enjoyed, then let me know if you'd like me to continue covering these episodes. This one didn't have too much science, unfortunately, but I did what I could. You saw. But leaving a like and subscribing is always appreciated as well, and I'll drop my Twitter, Roanoke Tales, Discord, and Patreon in the description for all those interested. And speaking of patrons, I'd like to thank mine real quick. First, huge thank you to our astrophysicist, Death Dancer, as well as Phoenix305. I'd also like to thank our scientists, Countryside Limbo, Lakune, and Logan Satomi. And to the rest of my patrons, I thank you guys as well. Your help goes a long way towards keeping everything running and is greatly appreciated. All right, so that's going to do it for me. I hope everyone enjoyed, and we'll see y'all in the next one.